necessarily advocate for formulaic writing or the standard 5-paragraph essay, generally introductory paragraphs do contain the following: a hook, background information on the topic, and a thesis or claim statement. There are exceptions, of course. If you are writing a news article or a narrative, for example, the writing is completely different. However, it is a safe bet that when writing an argumentative, informative, or analytical essay, you can write a winning introduction if you include those elements. Now, I'm going to cover thesis and claim statements in a separate tutorial. So for this one, we'll just focus on hooks and background information. So first, hooks. Now, the purpose of a hook is to do just as the name suggests and hook the reader in. Unfortunately, many students butcher the hook and it ends up doing quite the opposite, boring me to death. Now, I haven't died yet from reading a student's essay, but I have come quite close. So we're going to talk about the various types of hooks, and the first type is a question. Now, students use this one all the time because they're like, oh, it's so easy. I just write some random question about my topic. But then they end up writing very mundane questions that aren't even hooks at all, such as, do you like basketball? Have you ever heard of Michael Jordan? Do you like homework? Do you know how many people live in Utah? Like, these are not engaging, and that's the whole point of a hook, so they're not hooks. They don't stop and make you think, not really. Maybe you don't know how many people live in Utah. I mean, I sure don't, but it's still not an engaging question. I just answer no and I move on. If you use a question for hook, you have to pose one that actually causes the reader to stop and think, like these examples. First example, while cell phones are becoming a given in teenagers' lives, are they doing more harm than good? If you're a parent, this would get you to stop and think about your own child and how it's affecting his or her life. And if you are a teenager actually using one, you might not have even thought of the disadvantages, so this would get you thinking of those. But the point is that it gets you thinking. Now we have the second example. What would you do if you could play God for a day? That's exactly what the leaders of the tiny island nation of Guam tried to answer. So this paper is going to talk about the characters in that book, and the awesome thing about this question is it places you in the position of the characters, so you can start to relate to them. But more importantly, it makes you think, makes you get creative and imaginative. These are good, effective questions. So if you're going to use a question, it's got to be a thought-provoking question. Otherwise, it's not a hook. The next one is a quotation. It can be a quote from literature, a famous person, or a quote found on motivational sites. Now, this is a great hook type, but it can be misused if you just plop in a quote and then move on. You kind of need to establish a connection. So let me show you what I mean. So this first part here is the quote from Michael Jordan, saying that some people just wish for it to happen and others make people make it happen. Now this part right here where I've bracketed is actually my connection to my background information. So I move from hook, connection, into background information. So let's look at my connection. While many people want, dream, wish, and pray that they will one day make it to the big stage, they are just wishers and dreamers. It is only when these wishers and dreamers take matters into their own hands and strive to do the best that they can actually get to play professional basketball in the NBA. So I'm connecting this quote that Michael Jordan said to the topic of my paper, or leading into the background information, which is Michael Jordan certainly worked hard to get to the NBA and make his dreams a reality. So I'm taking his quote, and then I'm showing, lots of people don't follow this, and that's why they don't get to the NBA. Michael Jordan did, and then I have my background information on Michael Jordan's making it to the NBA, but then I'm not going to go into the details because that's for the rest of the paper. Okay, then let's look at another example here. So I have a quote by Steven Spielberg. He said, "Technology can be our best friend, and technology can also be the biggest party pooper of our lives. It interrupts our own story, interrupts our ability to have a thought or a daydream, to imagine something wonderful because we're too busy bridging the walk from the cafeteria back to the office on the cell phone." Now, since my paper is going to be specifically about young teenagers and cell phones, I have to take the quote here and connect it to that idea. So I again have bracketed my connection. As Stephen noted, cell phones can negatively affect adults who have not had the time to mature and develop their story. So you can imagine how much it can affect the life of a young teenager. And then I can start, giving some background information and then my thesis. Now the next type is a statistic. Now, a statistic is, similar to a quote, but it's a different kind of quote. It's a specific type of quote. It's a statistic. So I kind of make this a separate hook here. And this works best for informational essays. And just like with quotes, you have to connect the statistic to the rest of your introduction. So let's look at some examples here. So I have this statistic of how few people get into the MBA. And it's a surprising statistic. We all know very few get in, but we don't know how few. And then I have the connection here, right here. Basically, only a few high school players will make it to the NBA. Even though there are many that strive, play, train, practice, and fight to be great, a huge majority of them do not make it. And now I'm going to connect it to Michael Jordan, which is my topic. My topic is not about how few make it, but that quote relates, so I show the connection. That statistic relates, so I show the connection. And then I say not only did Michael Jordan make it, but he went on to become one of the biggest names in the NBA. Connecting that quote, that statistic, to my topic, Michael Jordan. Now let's look at a cell phone one, the paper on cell phones. Sorry, I can't get it to go to the next slide. Ha ha ha. All right, here we go. The average person checks their cell phone 110 times a day. That's an average of 9 times hourly. So I've got this quote that talks, or the statistic, it's also a quote, but it's a statistic that, tells you how often we check our phones, which is pretty surprising. And now here, I'm going to make my connection. Checking their phone 100 times a day and spending hours on social media can cause young teens to need to fill their downtime without leaving room to explore other hobbies and interests. So I'm bringing in the statistic into my topic of young teens. Now the next type of hook here is a surprising fact or definition. Now you just have to make sure it's surprising fact. It's not a common sense fact. So this first one, Michael Jordan was the first athlete in history to become a billionaire. I did not know that. I didn't know that other ones before him had not become billionaires. I assumed they all had. But what do I know? So to me, that was surprising. And then the second one, the first mobile call was made by Martin Cooper in 1973. But while the technology was available, they didn't start selling them until the 80s. Holy cow, I had no clue they were available that early. 1973, we had cell phones? It's crazy. But the first cell phone cost $4,000, so that's probably why a whole lot of people didn't use them. This is a surprising fact. The next type of hook is an anecdote, which is just a fancy word for a short story. And people love to read stories. So even if your essay is not a narrative, you can begin with a story to hook us in. The story can be a figment of your own imagination, or it can be a real story, either your real story or someone else's. So for our Michael Jordan paper, we have this story here that is about a kid seeing another kid work really, really hard at basketball practice. And then he ended up getting drafted for the Philadelphia 79ers, and he knew why. All that hard work had paid off for him. This is the hard work ethics and mindset that everyone that wants to make it to the NBA should have. So he tells that story about this guy who worked really hard, and then we're going to connect that then to Michael Jordan, who was very similar at working hard. And now for the cell phone paper, I told a story about when I got my first cell phone. I got my first cell phone when I was 20, and my parents gave it to me for Christmas, and I didn't want one, to tell you the truth. So I told this story, and after I tell this anecdote, I'll then connect it to my own paper. But this story is much more exciting to read as an introduction to my topic. And then the last type of hook is dialogue. It's similar to an anecdote, but you're not telling a full story, or you're just including a few lines of dialogue. Again, it can be real dialogue that people have said, or it can be imagined, like this one. Mom, I need a cell phone. Mom, please get me a cell phone. All my friends have one. I'll be so responsible. Please. Oh, you're ruining my life. Whine the teenagers across the country who do not have a cell phone. We can relate to hearing many people say that. So it is an interesting hook. So the idea here is to make it interesting, and you have a variety of options. You can begin with a question, a quote, an anecdote, dialogue, a statistic, surprising fact, or definition. The key here is to just make it interesting, and if it's not interesting, you don't have a hook, even if you have a question or a statistic. Once you have your reader's attention, you can start giving some background information on your topic leading up into the thesis. Now make sure the information you put here is not information that's going to be contained in the body of your paper. Sometimes you may not even need background information at all. In this case, you just have your hook, some type of transitional sentence, phrase, or word, and then your thesis. Now, for a rhetorical analysis on a piece of literature or nonfiction, for your background information, you can introduce the book title and author, and then give a brief synopsis of the piece. With an informational essay, if your reader needs to know information about your topic, and you know that most of your audience doesn't, in order to understand your thesis statement, then use the background information to fill in those gaps. This information can be scientific, historical, cultural, or actually even personal. For example, for an informational essay describing the attack on Pearl Harbor, how it happened, the result, and how the country reacted, the reader would need to know the relationship between Japan and the US at the time, and some information about World War II. You can use the background information to transition and connect your hook to your thesis. During this background information, you may introduce your topic's broad subject. Example, Michael Jordan, but it shouldn't tell the specific topic of your paper, like I'm going to talk about his childhood and his rise to the NBA. That you put in your thesis. For a literary analysis on a piece of literature or nonfiction, you can introduce the book title and author, then give a brief synopsis of the piece, and then, since you're going to analyze the theme, you will also want to provide how the piece's theme relates to society. With an argumentative essay, along with providing information about your topic that your reader needs to know in order to understand your claim, you can also explain the controversy surrounding your stance. So now that you have a better understanding of how to write an introductory paragraph, you will want to check out the description of this tutorial because it has a clickable link that will take you to a PDF file that shows you examples of introductory paragraphs. In each example, I have marked the hook in blue, the background information in black, and the thesis in red, so you can clearly see each of the elements.